March wind carried the acrid smell of coal smoke and something sharper, something chemical, through the open window of 221B Baker Street that gray afternoon when Professor Edmund Ashworth arrived at our door. I noticed him first from our window, a tall, spare man in his 50s, dressed in the sober black of academia, carrying himself with the rigid posture of someone accustomed to laboratory precision rather than the chaotic irregularities of the wider world. His face, even from that distance, showed the unmistakable signs of profound distress. Eyes red-rimmed, jaw clenched, movements betraying an agitation at odds with his otherwise controlled appearance. Before I continue with this remarkable case, please subscribe to Detective Sherlock if you haven't already. Your support allows us to keep bringing these mysteries to you. Now, let us proceed. Holmes, who had been examining a peculiar type of ash through his magnifying lens, looked up as Mrs. Hudson announced our visitor. Something in her tone, a mixture of concern and curiosity, caused Holmes to set aside his work immediately and rise to greet the professor with unusual courtesy. "Professor Ashworth," Holmes said, extending his hand. "Please sit down. You are clearly in considerable distress, and the matter that brings you here is, I suspect, both urgent and unusual." Ashworth blinked in surprise. "You know me, Mr. Holmes?" "I know of you," Holmes corrected. "Your pioneering work on metallic compounds and their reactions with organic tissues has been discussed in the chemical journals I regularly peruse. You hold the chair of experimental chemistry at King's College. You have published 17 papers in the past 5 years, and you are, if the latest edition of the Royal Society's proceedings is to be believed, currently engaged in research involving the precipitation of silver salts. The faint staining on your right forefinger and thumb confirms you have been handling silver nitrate solutions recently. Now, what has happened to bring you from your laboratory to my sitting room on what should be a routine working day?" Ashworth sank into the chair, his hands gripping the armrests. "Mr. Holmes, 3 days ago, one of my most promising students, a young man named David Hartley, was found dead in his rooms in Bloomsbury. The police have declared it suicide by poisoning. But I know with absolute certainty that David would never take his own life. Moreover, the poison that killed him was one of my own experimental compounds, a substance so rare and so carefully controlled that only a handful of people in England even know of its existence." Holmes's gray eyes sharpened with interest. "Tell me about this poison, its properties, its appearance, its effects." "I call it argentum lacrimae, silver tear," Ashworth said, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. "It is a compound of silver, mercury, and several organic alkaloids of my own synthesis. In its pure form, it appears as a perfectly spherical droplet of liquid metal, about the size of a small pea, with a silvery sheen that seems to shimmer with an internal light. When introduced into the human body, even in minute quantities, it causes paralysis of the respiratory muscles within minutes, followed by death. The victim remains fully conscious until the very end, able to see, hear, think, but unable to move or cry out. It is, Mr. Holmes, perhaps the most terrible way to die that chemistry has yet devised." I felt a chill run through me. Good God, Professor. Why would anyone create such a horror? "Its original purpose," Ashworth said with obvious anguish, "was medicinal. In extremely diluted form, it shows promise for treating certain neurological conditions. But in concentration, it is, as you say, a horror. I have kept only 3 samples in existence. One in my personal safe at the college laboratory, one in the Royal Society's secure vault, and one that I gave to David for his doctoral research 3 months ago. That third sample is now missing, and David is dead. Killed by what the police surgeon identified, though he did not recognize it, as an unknown metallic poison causing respiratory paralysis. Holmes was already reaching for his coat. "Watson, bring your medical bag. Professor, you will take us to see David Hartley's rooms immediately, and then to your laboratory. Time, I suspect, is of considerable importance." The lodgings where David Hartley had died were in a respectable boarding house on Gower Street, not far from the British Museum. The landlady, a Mrs. Pemberton, was a nervous woman who had clearly been deeply shaken by the death of her tenant. "Such a quiet young man," she told us, as she led us up 3 flights of narrow stairs. "Always polite, always paid his rent on time. Never had visitors, except for Professor Ashworth here, and occasionally another gentleman from the college. To think he'd do such a thing to himself." "What makes you certain it was suicide?" Holmes asked. "The police said so," Mrs. Pemberton replied. "Found him at his desk with a teacup beside him. They said he must have put the poison in his tea and drunk it down. The door was locked from the inside, the window was latched, and there was no sign of anyone else having been there." The room itself was exactly what one would expect of an impecunious graduate student. Small, spartanly furnished, but meticulously organized. A narrow bed occupied one corner, a wardrobe another. The center of the room was dominated by a writing desk positioned beneath the window, and it was here that David Hartley had died. Holmes moved immediately to the desk, his keen eyes taking in every detail. A teacup sat near the edge, its interior stained brown. Beside it lay an open notebook filled with chemical formulas and experimental notes in a precise, scholarly hand. A pen rested in its holder, and a small oil lamp, now cold, stood ready to provide light for evening work. "The cup," Holmes said to Professor Ashworth. "Would David have kept his own tea here, or would Mrs. Pemberton have brought it to him?" "David always took tea at 4 o'clock, Ashworth replied. "Mrs. Pemberton would bring it up to him. He was particular about his routines, a good quality in a scientist." Holmes lifted the teacup carefully and sniffed its interior. His nose wrinkled slightly. The silver tear was definitely introduced into this tea. The faint metallic scent is still detectable, though masked by the tannins. "Professor, you said the compound appears as a droplet. How would one administer it? Would it dissolve in liquid?" "It would sink to the bottom of the cup initially," Ashworth explained. "But upon agitation, stirring, or drinking, it would disperse throughout the liquid as microscopic particles. The victim would have no way of knowing the tea was poisoned until the first symptoms appeared, and by then, it would be far too late." Holmes examined the room with systematic thoroughness. He inspected the door lock and its key, finding no signs of forcing. He examined the window latch, noting its position. He studied the floor for footprints, the wardrobe for any disturbance, the bed for any signs of struggle. Finally, he turned his attention to the notebooks on the desk, paging through them with increasing interest. "Your student's final entries," Holmes said, "show a preoccupation with questions of compound stability and degradation. He was concerned about something, some property of the silver tear that troubled him. Here, 3 days before his death, he writes, 'The secondary reaction remains inconsistent. Professor A's formulation may be flawed, or perhaps deliberately obscured. Must investigate further.' And then, the day before his death, 'Disturbing implications if my suspicions prove correct. cannot discuss with anyone until I have proof." Ashworth went pale. "I saw none of this. David said nothing to me about concerns with the compound." "Which suggests," Holmes said quietly, "that his suspicions may have involved you, Professor, or someone close to you, someone he trusted enough to drink tea with but not enough to share his concerns." Over the following days, Holmes conducted an investigation of extraordinary breadth. We visited King's College, where Professor Ashworth showed us his laboratory, a cathedral of glass and brass filled with retorts, alembics, and carefully labeled bottles of chemicals. The safe, where Ashworth kept his sample of silver tear, was intact, its combination known only to him, and the sample itself remained secure in its specially designed glass vial. We interviewed David Hartley's fellow students, learning that he had been well-liked but intensely private about his research. One young man, a chemistry student named Peter Wickham, mentioned that David had seemed troubled in the weeks before his death and had once remarked that some discoveries are too dangerous to publish. We spoke with the police surgeon who had examined David's body. He confirmed the symptoms of metallic poisoning but admitted he had been unable to identify the specific compound. "Never seen anything quite like it," he said. "The tissues showed unusual silver staining, but the chemical analysis was inconclusive. We ruled it suicide because there was simply no other explanation. The room was locked, there was poison in his teacup, and he was alone." Holmes also made inquiries at chemical supply houses throughout London, seeking anyone who might have attempted to obtain the rare compounds necessary to synthesize silver tear. This proved fruitless. The components were so specialized and so carefully controlled that unauthorized purchase would be nearly impossible. It was on the fourth day of our investigation that Holmes announced he was ready to conduct an experiment. He had obtained permission from Mrs. Pemberton to examine David Hartley's room one final time, and he had asked Professor Ashworth, Peter Wickham, and two other individuals to be present. Dr. Harold Finch, another professor from King's College who specialized in toxicology, and a young woman named Catherine Hartley, David's sister, who had traveled from Cornwall upon learning of her brother's death. We assembled in the narrow room on Gower Street, 7 people crowded into a space meant for one. Holmes stood by the desk, his expression grave. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I have asked you here because this case presents certain features that can only be resolved through demonstration. David Hartley was murdered, of that I am certain. But the method of his murder was so clever, so perfectly designed to resemble suicide that even the police were deceived. The locked room, the poisoned tea, the apparent absence of any other person, all pointed to self-destruction. Yet there are facts that contradict this conclusion." He gestured to the notebook on the desk. David was on the verge of an important discovery, one that troubled him deeply. He suspected something about the silver tear compound, something that made him question his mentor's work. He was not a man contemplating suicide, but rather a man determined to uncover truth, no matter how uncomfortable. Catherine Hartley, a composed young woman with her brother's same intelligent eyes, spoke up. "Mr. Holmes, if my brother was murdered, who did it and how? You yourself have confirmed that the room was locked from within when his body was found." "Indeed," Holmes said, "which brings us to the heart of the matter. The murderer was never in this room at all. The poison was introduced remotely, at a time when the killer had a perfect alibi. To understand how, we must understand the unique properties of argentum lacrimae, the silver tear." He turned to Professor Ashworth. "Professor, You told us that the compound appears as a spherical droplet. You also mentioned that it requires very specific conditions for stability. What happens to silver tear when exposed to normal atmospheric conditions over time? Ashworth frowned, considering. It slowly oxidizes, forming a brittle shell. Eventually, after several days, the oxidized layer cracks, releasing the interior liquid suddenly. It's one of the compound's more unstable characteristics, one reason it has been difficult to develop for medical use. Precisely, Holmes said with satisfaction. Now, observe this teacup. Professor, would you examine its interior surface with this lens? Ashworth took the magnifying glass Holmes offered and peered into the cup. After a moment, his face went white. There are micro-scratches here, he said slowly. Fresh ones, not from normal use. They form a distinct pattern along the interior base of the cup, as if something had been deliberately scraped or embedded. Embedded exactly, Holmes confirmed. 3 days before David's death, someone came to this room when he was not here, possibly offering to clean or tidy, possibly under some other pretext, and carefully embedded several tiny particles of oxidized silver tear compound into the porous ceramic at the base of this teacup. The oxidation made them hard enough to scratch into the surface. The particles remained dormant until tea was poured over them. The heat and moisture began to dissolve the oxidized shell. By the time David drank his tea, the shell had cracked, releasing the deadly interior liquid. The effect would have appeared instantaneous from his perspective. He drank his afternoon tea, and within moments, the paralysis began. By the time he understood what was happening, he could no longer move or call for help. The room was utterly silent. Then Dr. Finch spoke, his voice shaking. That's monstrous. To die like that, alone, unable even to cry out. Indeed, Holmes said. But it was also brilliantly conceived. The murderer needed only brief access to this room days before the actual death. By the time the poison took effect, they were long gone, with a perfect alibi. The locked room ceased to be a mystery. Of course it was locked. David locked it himself, having no idea he had just consumed a fatal dose. The question is, who had both the knowledge to conceive this method and the motive to employ it? He turned his gaze to Professor Ashworth. Professor, you have been frank with us about your research, but I must now ask you directly. Is there any reason David Hartley might have suspected you of unethical conduct regarding the silver tear compound? Ashworth's face twisted with anguish. I swear to you, Mr. Holmes, I have done nothing unethical. My research has been entirely for medicinal purposes, but... He hesitated. There was a commercial interest. A pharmaceutical company approached me 6 months ago about purchasing the rights to silver tear, believing it might be developed into a profitable drug despite its dangers. I refused, but David somehow learned of the offer. He confronted me, accusing me of allowing myself to be courted by profiteers. We argued. I assured him I had rejected the proposal, but I'm not certain he believed me. And this pharmaceutical company, Holmes said. Its name? Sterling Chemical Industries, Ashworth replied. Their representative was a Dr. Harold Finch. All eyes turned to the toxicologist, who had been standing quietly near the door. His expression had shifted from scholarly interest to something altogether colder. Professor Ashworth exaggerates, Finch said carefully. Sterling merely inquired about the research. There was never any formal offer and certainly no pressure. I was representing them as a scientific consultant, nothing more. Nothing more. Holmes's voice was sharp. Dr. Finch, you are listed in the King's College Registry as having access to Professor Ashworth's laboratory. You have the chemical knowledge to understand Silvertear's properties. And you had motive. David Hartley's suspicions, if shared publicly, would have ruined your consulting arrangement with Sterling and possibly your academic career. A young man threatening to expose what he saw as commercial corruption had to be silenced. Finch's face had gone grey, but his voice remained steady. This is speculation, Mr. Holmes. Offensive speculation. I have done nothing wrong. Then you will have no objection, Holmes said, producing a small evidence bag from his pocket, to having your coat examined for traces of silver compounds. You see, embedding particles into ceramic leaves residue on one's fingers and clothing. The oxidized silver has a distinctive spectroscopic signature. If you are innocent, such an examination will exonerate you immediately. For a long moment, Finch said nothing. Then, with a sudden movement, he lunged for the door. But Holmes had anticipated this. He seized Finch's arm with surprising strength, and I stepped forward to block the exit. Peter Wickham, showing admirable presence of mind, grasped Finch's other arm. The struggle was brief. Dr. Harold Finch, respected toxicologist and murderer, slumped in defeat. I did nothing wrong, he said again, but his voice was hollow. David Hartley was going to destroy years of research with his moral posturing. Silvertear could save lives if properly developed, but he wanted to prevent its commercialization entirely. He was going to publish a paper condemning it as too dangerous, based on preliminary findings he didn't understand. I tried to reason with him, but he refused to listen. So yes, I came to his rooms 3 days before, claiming I wanted to examine his research notes. Mrs. Pemberton let me in. She knows me from the college. I scraped particles into his teacup and left. I told myself it was justice. I told myself his death would serve the greater good. You told yourself lies, Holmes said coldly. You murdered a young man because he stood between you and profit. There is no philosophy that excuses that. The trial of Dr. Harold Finch became something of a sensation in the scientific community. The revelation that an academic of such standing had committed murder using an experimental poison shocked the Royal Society and led to widespread reforms in how dangerous compounds were handled and monitored. Professor Ashworth, devastated by the betrayal of his colleague and the loss of his student, destroyed all remaining samples of Silvertear and ceased work on metallic compounds entirely, turning his research towards safer fields. Catherine Hartley thanked Holmes personally, expressing gratitude that her brother's death had not been in vain. The safety measures instituted as a result of the case would, she hoped, prevent similar tragedies. Holmes accepted her thanks with his characteristic reserve, but seemed genuinely moved by her composure in the face of such grief. Some weeks after the case concluded, I found Holmes in his laboratory at Baker Street, conducting an experiment with various silver compounds. The bench was covered with test tubes and beakers, each containing liquids of slightly different metallic sheens. Still thinking about the Silvertear? I asked. Holmes looked up, his expression thoughtful. I am considering the moral questions it raises, Watson. Ashworth created something with potential for both great good and terrible evil. His intentions were admirable, but his naivete was dangerous. He assumed that scientific knowledge, once released into the world, would be used only for noble purposes. Finch proved how wrong that assumption was. He gestured to the array of silvery liquids before him. Every one of these compounds could be weaponized. Mercury, silver salts, platinum derivatives, all have legitimate medical uses, and all could be turned to murder in the right hands. The question is not whether we should pursue such knowledge, but how we safeguard it once obtained. "And your conclusion?" I asked. "That science without ethics is as dangerous as ethics without knowledge," Holmes replied. Ashworth had knowledge, but underestimated the ethical corruption of those around him. Finch had the appearance of ethics, but lacked the genuine article. David Hartley seems to have possessed both, which is precisely why he had to be eliminated by those who had neither. He carefully decanted one of the silver solutions into a waste container. "The silver tear was aptly named, Watson. It appeared beautiful, almost magical in its perfection. But its nature was poison, and it left behind only grief. Perhaps there is a lesson there about judging by appearances, whether of compounds or of men." I thought of Dr. Finch, urbane, educated, respected, who had murdered a brilliant young man to protect his consulting fees. I thought of David Hartley, who had seen through the gleaming surface to the corruption beneath and paid with his life for that clarity of vision. "The world lost a good scientist," I said quietly. "More than that," Holmes replied. "It lost a good man, which is rarer still. Science produces hundreds of competent researchers every year, but genuine moral courage, the willingness to speak uncomfortable truths regardless of cost, that is precious beyond any compound that can be synthesized in a laboratory." Years later, when I came to write up this case for publication, I debated whether to include all the technical details of the silver tear compound. Ultimately, I decided to describe it only in general terms, omitting the specific chemical formulations that might allow replication. Holmes, when I showed him my manuscript, approved. "You show wisdom, Watson," he said. "Some knowledge is best left unpublished. The world does not need instructions for creating such poisons, even in the name of scientific accuracy. Let the general principle suffice, that clever men can create terrible things, and that other men, no less clever, will find ways to misuse them." The case of the chemist's silver tear remains, in my memory, one of the darkest we investigated, not because of the complexity of the crime, which was considerable, but because of what it revealed about the ease with which noble intentions can be perverted into deadly tools. David Hartley sought to protect humanity from a dangerous compound. Harold Finch sought to profit from it. In the collision between conscience and greed, conscience lost. But not entirely. The reforms that followed, the heightened awareness of research ethics, the stricter controls on experimental compounds, these were David's legacy, purchased at the cost of his life. And Holmes's exposure of the murder method ensured that the silver tear could never be used in such a manner again, for its properties were now known and guarded against. Professor Ashworth, in the years that followed, became an advocate for scientific responsibility, speaking widely about the need for researchers to consider not merely what could be created, but what should be created. He carried the weight of David Hartley's death with visible pain, but he channeled that pain into constructive action that may well have saved other lives. As for Holmes, the case seemed to affect him more deeply than most. He had always been suspicious of purely academic knowledge divorced from practical wisdom, and the chemist's silver tear confirmed his instincts. In later years, when consulted on matters involving experimental science or dangerous inventions, he invariably asked the same question.
But what happens when this falls into the wrong hands? It is perhaps the question every scientist should be required to answer before beginning any research with potential for harm. David Hartley asked it and paid the ultimate price.
Harold Finch refused to ask it and became the very wrong hands he should have feared. Professor Ashworth failed to ask it soon enough and lived with the consequences of that failure. And Sherlock Holmes? He asked it constantly, wielded his own considerable knowledge with careful restraint, and used his remarkable gifts to ensure that others who failed to ask that question faced the consequences of their moral blindness. The silver tear, that beautiful, terrible droplet of liquid metal, was destroyed, its samples incinerated, its formulation struck from the records. But the tears it caused, the grief of Catherine Hartley and others who loved David, those could never be so easily erased. They remain as testament to the cost of knowledge pursued without wisdom, of science divorced from conscience, and of the price that innocence pays when corruption wears the mask of respectability. In the end, the case taught us what Holmes had perhaps always known, that the most dangerous poisons are not those synthesized in laboratories, but those that corrode the human soul: greed, pride, and the willingness to sacrifice others for personal gain. These require no elaborate chemical knowledge to create. They exist in every heart that chooses profit over principle, convenience over conscience, self-interest over service to others. Dr. Harold Finch created no new poison when he murdered David Hartley. He merely gave physical form to the corruption that already existed within him, using the silver tear as his instrument. The real poison was in his character, not in the teacup. And that, perhaps, is the true lesson of the chemist's silver tear: that we are all responsible for the tools we create and the uses to which they are put. But more fundamentally, we are responsible for the moral choices we make about those uses. Science can give us power, but only conscience can teach us wisdom. And in the absence of wisdom, power becomes merely another name for danger.